in 1990, I was a brand new professor at UC Berkeley. I was recently elected to the school board in Berkeley, and I was teaching at a local continuation high school all at the same time. And I don't recommend that usually to new professors, but I was kind of talked into it because they said, well, since you're not leaving, you should stay and do something like serve on the school board, and I did. And one of the things we did was we would hear expulsion cases. The board would serve as a kind of hearing, quasi-judicial body that would hear cases. And in almost all cases, the students that came before us had done something really bad. But in almost every case, the students who came before us were among our most vulnerable students. Students in special education, students in group homes, students in foster care. I recall one incident in particular of a group of girls, ninth grade girls, who had been involved in some really terrible violence at the high school, beating up other girls for the crime of being too cute, and beating them up in a terrible way. Some of the girls were so badly injured they had to be hospitalized. So as I read the case, I thought to myself, well, this is going to be easy. This is going to be, I won't have to wait a long time to figure out what's the right thing to do here. They've clearly done something terrible. They need to be punished severely. And then we met the girls and heard their stories, and it became so clear that each one of them was a victim. Each one of them had been crying out for help much earlier on that they never received. And the fact that they lashed out at these other girls was really just another indicator of how badly marginalized they were. I start with that story because I would say that in many of our schools, we disproportionately punish the children with the greatest needs. And if you think about it for just a little while, you'll realize that we often punish them because of those unmet needs. Children who don't have supportive homes or don't have stable homes often are angry and insolent and difficult in school, just as any of us might be without stable homes. Working with Austin Butner now in Los Angeles, they're trying to bring eyeglasses to schools. Their estimate is about 40% of low-income kids need eyeglasses. Hard to read if you can't see. There are so many unmet needs, and we still treat it as though this were an outlier issue. When anyone who knows California knows these are our children. As a nation, we have embraced slogans as policy, like No Child Behind. I often point out to people that that slogan came from the Children's Defense Fund. And Marion Wright Edelman came up with the slogan, Leave No Child Behind. It didn't mean test the children as frequently as possible. She had something else in mind. It was about health and nutrition and well-being. But somehow No Child Behind didn't mean that kids were going to get eyeglasses or get access to a dentist or a social worker. And so consequently, we, despite the policies, and Every Student Succeeds is just the latest example, we still don't have policies that allow us to meet the needs of our most vulnerable kids. So I want to applaud EdSource for making this the theme of the conference, because I think we'll only begin to address this issue if we take it from the margin to the center and acknowledge these are our kids. Now, again, it's important to put this in a national context. It's not simply a California problem. This is an American problem. And all across America, we see child poverty rates are incredibly high. California has among the highest in the nation. We have large numbers of kids who don't have access to good health insurance, good access to preschool. Large numbers of kids, particularly Black and Latino kids, who are languishing in our most struggling schools, and we're one of few countries in the world that continues to spend less money on the neediest kids than the wealthiest kids. And I often point out to people, the only people who say money doesn't matter are people with lots of money. Because usually in the districts where there are few resources, they readily say we need more. Now, it's also true they may not know what to do with those resources sometimes. And we're seeing that now with the LCAP funds. But the fact of the matter is we know that there are lots of kids in need and lots of kids that are not getting their needs. EdTrust has been doing great work on shining the light on these issues and pointing out that these are California's kids. Because in California, not only do we have large numbers of kids who are poor, but we have large numbers who are English learners and a growing population of kids who are Black and Latino. So this is our future. And the question is, what are we doing to ensure that our schools have a chance to meet the needs of the children who will become our future parents, our voters, our workers? And I don't think right now we are using the research that is available to us to do what is possible. Now, I recognize right away that we are faced with enormous constraints, particularly at the local level. Our schools are overwhelmed by the needs. And we are one of few societies that expect schools to solve this by themselves. Canadians don't expect that. They actually do provide supports outside of school to make sure schools serving poor children receive the help they need. In this country, we have a schools alone strategy. And therefore, the schools that serve the children with the greatest needs are the schools that tend to always be failing. But there's a lot about that when we start to unpack it that we know that there are certain kids, based upon their profile, their demographics, their life circumstances, they're at much greater need and therefore much more likely to drop out of school or to fail in school. And given what we know about these children, the question becomes, what do we do to provide targeted support? I'm working with several high schools right now in Los Angeles that are serving large numbers of unaccompanied minors. And I was in a classroom recently with a teacher who is totally unprepared because in our schools we typically assign the least qualified teachers to work with the most challenging kids, despite the fact there's no research to support that strategy. And he's a brand new teacher struggling, and he's teaching these children, some of whom are 14, as many as 17, 18, all in 9th grade, many of them not literate in their native language, but he's teaching them as though he's teaching first graders, with dittos, giving them basic words. And I tried to explain to him, I said, although these kids may not have a lot of education, formal education, because they didn't go to school regularly in their own countries, they're not dumb kids. These are incredibly resilient kids who traveled from Central America and made it to California without a train ticket, having to navigate some of the most dangerous people and places along the way. These are incredibly smart, resilient kids you have before you. And he was not sure what to do with that because all he could see was what they couldn't do. And I would say that that focus on the deficits, that focus on the needs, prevent us from building resilience in these children because you can't build resilience if you don't see the strengths. And so, yep, there are lots of kids out there that we know, based upon their backgrounds and based upon past patterns, are likely to fail, but there's also lots of research about how to make failure less likely. And so part of what I want to suggest is that once we acknowledge that we can't allow the teacher to do this by themselves, which is what we've been doing, that we actually do need social workers and health workers in schools or working with schools, then it forces us to think, okay, how do we utilize those resources effectively to start to build a support system? The group of us at UCLA trying to think about how to do that right now for children in foster care, because they have some of the worst outcomes of all kids. And one of the things we realize, we spend already thousands of dollars on these kids in the most ineffective manner. Because despite the resources spent through the county offices of education and through various social services and sometimes the courts, we still have lots and lots of kids who slip through the cracks. We have an expensive system that doesn't work. And the challenge is, how do we change that system so that it can not only be more cost-effective, but more responsive to the needs of the kids? Knowing full well there are a lot of adults who depend on that system too for their jobs, which is one of the biggest reasons why it's hard to change. So part of what we've got to do to get there is we've got to recognize first and foremost that the risks the kids face are largely in their environments. It's in the circumstances. Too often we locate the risk in the child, him or herself. And we think our job is to fix the child, to change the child. Now, I have 5 kids of my own. Changing children? Changing diapers is one thing, but changing children? A whole nother thing. But I also know this, that when we can change the environment they're in, when we can change the opportunities available to them, we can begin to change outcomes for them too. But in many schools, we have assumptions about those kids, which is one of the reasons why we so often reflexively punish or marginalize through special ed programs that don't serve their needs, or place them in bungalows with teachers that are not qualified to meet their needs, because we don't see the potential, we don't see the possibility that those kids with the right support could actually have very different outcomes. In too many schools, and I saw this so clearly when I lived here in the Bay Area, there's a way in which failure becomes normalized and complacency sets in, because we get used to the idea that certain kids from certain neighborhoods will not perform, that they will always have worse outcomes. And when that mindset sets in, it becomes very difficult to disrupt them. And so part of what we've got to do if we're going to change outcomes is start to change minds, first of all, about the nature of the risk facing our children. If we believe that we can, in fact, create schools that will do a better job at meeting their needs, schools like the brand new school in the Bronx for children in foster care that's showing that you can actually educate kids in foster care and get better outcomes when you provide access to the supports here on site. And so when we begin to look at models that work, it seems a little bit less daunting than it does in many cases. We know that there are kids whose troubles really are located at home because the family doesn't have stability, the family doesn't have the means to provide, or maybe there's substance abuse or other challenges in the family. But we also know that if schools exacerbate that by ignoring the needs of the child, that we've compounded the problem, which is often what occurs. Several years ago, I was given a tour of a school here in the Bay Area, and toured by an assistant principal who's showing me the new library, computer facility, and very proud of everything in the building. And then we get to his office, and he sees a little boy about 8 years old outside the door waiting for him. And he turns to me and says, "See that kid?" He said, "There's a prison cell in San Quentin waiting for that boy right now." And I turned to him and I said, "Wow." I said, "How do you know that?" He says, "Well, he is constantly in trouble. His father's in prison. He's got a brother in prison, and I can tell by the way he behaves that that's just where he's headed." So then I turn and ask, "Well, given what you know about this boy, what is the school doing to keep him out of prison?" And he looks at me surprised because he didn't think that was his job. In fact, what he was about to do was to suspend him for an extended period, for a month. Send the work home to his sick grandmother so they could collect the ADA, and effectively wash his hands of this boy at 8. I think we can do better than that. And versions of that play out in lots and lots of our schools because so often we ignore the needs of our kids. And the educators assigned to work with them lack the insights, lack the knowledge, lack the resources to figure out how to respond more effectively. Just recently, we've become more and more aware of trauma, and called now toxic stress, and the fact that that is an educational issue. And where the fact that there are lots of kids out there who are exposed to violence, particularly kids in poverty, and that it affects things like attention and memory and impulse control. It's an educational issue. Poverty is not simply an economic issue, it's a social issue, it's a psychological issue for many kids. And we have lots and lots of kids who come to school experience this kind of stress. This chart, just really profound illustration of how far it goes. If you compare the Ohio National Guard to children in Detroit on several indicators of trauma, the children in Detroit far exceed the returning veterans. Except the difference is that for the veterans, hopefully, the stress is over when they return. But for the children, it's ongoing, it's chronic. And so, what do we do when large numbers of kids come to us who've experienced trauma and stress? And again, these kids come in many different shapes and sizes and different circumstances. Part of what we've got to start to do is something that we should have known all along, which is that academic achievement and youth development are totally related. That is that hungry kids don't do well in school, and if we want to think about educating kids, we've got to recognize the developmental needs too. Which means that as we think about how to serve our most vulnerable kids, we've got to think about who's teaching those kids and how are they trained. And what kind of support do they have in figuring out how to meet those needs? I'm enjoying my time at UCLA because we have a residency-based teacher ed program. And I get to see them in schools and how they operate. And I often point out to people, we produce great teachers, but they're great novices. They're not master teachers. Don't assign your novices to your most challenging kids. We don't do that in any other field. We don't assign novice electricians to wire houses. Education is one of the few fields where we assign the least prepared people the most challenging work to do. And so, as we start to think about what it takes, then we're going to have to realize that we're going to have to change practices in a lot of areas, from how we assign teachers to how we intervene. Too many schools, we intervene too late, even though the signs of trouble appear early. Early intervention always works a lot better, and it's more cost effective. And we don't do a good job of building the partnerships. Partnerships we need, because without those partnerships, then we're expecting schools and teachers to do the work by themselves. Special education, which is usually the biggest cost item in many district budgets, is too often not a place where there are effective systems of support. Both because the IEP is not really honored as a true way in which to intervene and support a child. If it were, we would all want our children in special ed, wouldn't we? Wouldn't you want a learning plan for your child that was going to meet their needs? I often say that whenever I hear special ed described as a place, I know there's a problem. Because usually it's a place where we put the kids we don't know how to serve or don't want to serve. And so we need to make sure that we are, in fact, not just coming up with new labels on kids that marginalize them and limit their support, and that we are not creating programs that we claim help, but in fact don't show demonstration that they can make a difference for them. So the hard work we've got to do involves changing the support systems and changing the practices that we know now push kids out of school or push them onto what some now call the school-to-prison pipeline. It's an apt metaphor, because who do we incarcerate? Almost always those we fail to educate. As I said already, we rely on exclusion and humiliation as the primary forms of discipline. This is the reason why so many schools are struggling with restorative practices. They don't know what to do. They don't suspend. They're clueless. What do we do then? And then there are many schools trying to do restorative practices that don't realize if you don't change the culture, there's nothing to restore the children to. And so we've got to go deeper, and we've got to therefore put equity right at the center of what we're doing. Now, I want to give California a lot of credit because now we have an equity funding formula, and we have lots of policies that are pushing us in the direction, but unless equity gets operationalized at the site and district level, I don't think we're going to see the change we're hoping for. How do we make high standards accessible? How do we ensure that we're leveling the playing field? How do we address those gaps in opportunity that we know show up all the time? I have to remind educators all the time, for example, that homework is an equity issue. How many of you help your own kids with homework? Even when you're tired, and even when you don't understand it. And how many of you know that you have students right now that have no one to help them, may not even have a place to get it done? How do we take that into account when homework is assigned? If we don't, then invariably the kids with the greatest needs will always be the kids who fall further behind. And so we've got to be focused on outcomes, but we've also got to be focused on how to make sure that kids have access to support they need to reach better outcomes. So we do have policies and strategies across the country that have shown work. Community schools do work. How many of you have community schools in your community now? Right? It's growing. We know it's also hard. The best model, the Harlem Children's Zone, is an excellent model, but it's an expensive model. Right? Jeff's raised over $175 million to support 12,000 students in Central Harlem. Very hard to replicate in other communities, but there are communities doing it now by drawing on local resources and building partnerships. Vancouver, Washington is a model now. Every school in the system has access to health services and social services and after-school programs and preschool. Because as poverty rates have risen, they've realized they had to do more for kids. And so we've got to learn from the strategies that we see out there that are working. Implementing what I would call a preventative strategy towards discipline. The opposite of what I saw at that school where the principal was about, or the assistant principal about to send the boy home, who he knew very well, couldn't be supervised by his grandmother. We've got to figure out how to not only build a culture in schools that reinforces the kinds of values and norms that are essential for safety and for order and for learning, but that also keep kids connected to learning. We've got to engage parents earlier. We've got to find out what the causes are of those discipline problems. And we've got to design interventions and discipline that actually teaches kids the lessons, reinforces the values. Lawrence Kohlberg wrote many years ago, the goal of discipline is not to teach kids to avoid punishment. It's to teach kids to do what's right even when we're not looking. And I think if more schools understood that that's what we're really after, we would do this work differently. This is what David Banks understood when he founded Eagle Academy in the South Bronx. Eagle Academy is located right next to the jail in the South Bronx, in the courthouse. So every morning you can see men and women being brought in to be arraigned. David was an attorney working out of that courthouse. He decided he was so fed up with seeing so many young men coming in to be arraigned and go to prison. He said, I need to create a school that can counter the pull of the streets. So he created Eagle Academy. First time I ran to Eagle Academy was on the train. Subway in New York. The worst time the subway is at 3:30. I was there at 3:30. Subway car was loud, full of kids. I see 3 young men in ties, and I see one offer his seat to a pregnant woman. So I was curious. I thought perhaps they were Mormons. And they explained they weren't Mormons. They were from Eagle Academy, coming from the Museum of Natural History, headed back to their school. And I asked, who taught you to give up your seat like that? I was impressed by that. He said, well, that's the Eagle way. So I arranged a time to visit the school, and David provided me with a a chance to tour the school. I learned about what the Eagle Way is. And the Eagle Way starts with things like this, with fencing. I said, fencing in the Bronx? David, what kids do fencing in the Bronx? He said, my kids do it. My kids do that. They do chess. They do rugby. I said, rugby? That's right. The prep schools do it. We do it too. Because the strategy for keeping kids away from the streets is to keep them so busy, so involved, they don't have time for the streets. Every child is learning to play an instrument. Every child is a mentor. And they find ways to keep kids engaged in the classroom. So it's not about sitting and listening, but tapping into their energy and channeling energy. And so now they've got a school that is a beacon of hope in the Bronx, and they spread it to every borough and now Newark. And some people go and they see it and they say, well, that's all it takes, just get the boys together. I say, no, wrong. Wrong response. It's not just about bringing boys together. Prisons bring boys together already. You still got to focus on the quality of the teacher, the leadership, the culture, the supports. Because I'm seeing people think it's just about segregating boys of color, and I'd say you missed the point of what this work really entails. Just like we missed the point about grit. You know, Andrew Duckworth's gotten so much attention, Genius Award, for coming up with the idea that kids should work hard. So, wow, we got a Genius Award for that one. You know what I know? People working hard without opportunity usually stay broke. Hard work without opportunity leaves you tired and broke. A couple years ago, I wrote an article with one of my students called Grit versus Agency. So that's what the kids really need, is agency, because agency is not just about hard work. It's about critical thinking. It's about knowing how to seek help when you need it. It's about tapping into collective agency among the staff, in the parents, in the community. It's about reading the circumstances and understand the barriers our kids face and strategizing on how to overcome them. Resilience can't be reduced to a slogan like grit. It takes more than that. So we've got to help kids think about their futures. Here's a simple thing we know. Kids who think they're going somewhere behave differently than kids who think they're going nowhere. My colleague Chris Luker study on teen pregnancy. Question she asked in her book, Dubious Conceptions, is why is it that middle-class girls are less likely to have babies as teenagers than poor girls? And what she finds is that it's really not about sex, though clearly sex is involved. The big difference between the middle-class girls and the low-income girls was college aspirations, college plans. If you think you're going to college, you think having a baby at 15 is not a good idea. We can't simply promote the idea of college without also looking at what it takes to get access. Affluent families now don't even rely on the counselor anymore for college access. They pay private consultants to work their kids through the whole process. Every time we think we level the playing field, we realize there are yet more obstacles. Many of our schools, there are 300 to 400 students per counselor. So who's really doing the work of helping kids with financial aid applications and figuring out the process? I have helped 4 of my kids now go to college. And I'm a college professor. And each time we cried. We were stressed out. I still have the scars from it. What about our parents who haven't gone to college and don't know how it works? So we need to understand what those needs are. We need to know our kids, and we need to design schools that are intentionally prepared to meet their needs. That's the mismatch we have enclosed. I would say so often the schools that are serving our kids lack the resources, lack the skills to meet the needs of the kids. That's the gap we haven't touched. And until we do, we're not going to see patterns for our most vulnerable children begin to change. There are examples right now of schools that are doing more. I live in Culver City, California. Culver City has more kids of color taking and passing advanced placement courses than any high school in the state on a per capita basis. It also has a food pantry. on site, because 70% of the kids at that school are low income, and many of them experience food insecurity. They realize they have to do more than merely provide an academic setting. They have to address the social needs. And so what we need to do is to create this broader system of support. And I'll close with this, because I've been told I'm out of time. When we think holistically about our kids, when we recognize that the academic needs are connected to the health needs, to the safety, to housing, and all the other needs that children bring, then I believe we start to create the conditions that make success more likely. The good news is there are schools like this across the country that are showing us how to do this work. The bad news is that we don't learn from those schools. And those schools don't serve as a basis for guiding and developing policy at the local, state, or the federal level. It's when we change that we're going to start to see outcomes improve. Mike Fullen often points to Toronto and the gains that have been made there. And one of the big differences about Toronto versus most other large urban systems is that when a school is struggling, they don't threaten the principal. They actually go in and say, how can we help? They call it capacity building. And when we do that kind of work in our schools, when we are there to provide the help and the support, I believe that we can, in fact, change the outcomes.
Pedro, I did want to just ask you, Pedro, because your talk is coming at a moment in history that is extremely challenging for the country and the world. You're talking about vulnerable children. I'm wondering to what extent you see the kids that we are referring to are feeling more marginalized or more threatened as a result of some of the rhetoric and the policies of the administration in Washington. California, I think we have a sense that we're somewhat protected. We have a progressive governor, we have a progressive legislature, and but obviously, and I see this with my own kids, they are following what is going on in Washington and with the Trump administration because of their connectedness online. So what are you seeing out there?
Well, I'm seeing there's a lot of fear. And even though we do have a state legislature and many districts that have declared themselves to be sanctuary schools and districts and cities and states, fact is there are many places that haven't. I was up in Northern California a couple weeks ago, and I was, before visiting, several teachers contacted me and said, this district has not declared itself a sanctuary district, and many kids are frightened. Can you speak to the board and superintendent about this? And I did, but I also know that the politics are like there. And many board members said that they are afraid of doing it because of backlash in their community. So I think it would be a mistake to say that because we're in California that everything's okay. We've had many deportations occur very recently here. That is an educational issue. Kids don't do well when they're worried about coming home and not finding their family anymore. And we're seeing large numbers of children who are not coming to school out of fear that they may be deported. So it is having an impact. I think that our state leaders are doing a good job of sending a message of support, but I think there are limitations to what they can do given that immigration is a federal matter.
Let me ask you about your, some of the issues that come up at your alma mater on free speech. Also, one of your schools that you were in charge of when you were on the Berkeley School Board, Berkeley High School, just an incident there just last week where some students put up some racist and homophobic and other offensive images on Instagram. And many students are extremely upset. They want those students expelled. But actually, the whole issue of you can't actually expel a kid for putting up something that's unrelated to the school, and there's free speech on the internet. But there's a great deal of sensitivity and vulnerability, and how one deals with those kinds of issues seems to be very difficult. How do schools deal with these very difficult, not only racial, but also anti-gay and other expressions?
There's no easy answers for that. I do think, and this is something we really have.
And we'll be getting into some of this on the panels, but I just wanted to get your thoughts.
I think that we do have to prepare kids to be able to engage in intelligent debate, using evidence to support their arguments, listening to people they disagree with, because the fact is, if that's one of the issues I see particularly about Berkeley. We think we live in a bubble, right? And we don't. We still live in the United States. And occasionally the views and the beliefs that are at odds with some of those we hold, we're reminded that they're out there too. And if we don't prepare our students to be able to address those and to think intelligently about why they believe what they believe and how to support their ideas, I think we're doing them a disservice. And I think a lot of schools have avoided addressing the issues. You can't avoid, now the problem is that the president says something crazy almost every day, so it's hard to stay focused, but you can't simply write this off. I think that they're too important, and I think that part of what we should have learned from this last election is that if our kids are not prepared with critical thinking, they won't be able to distinguish between fake news and real news, and if they're not prepared to engage with people they don't think like in intelligent discussion and debate, then they're not going to be really prepared to participate in this democracy. So I think we have work to do. And I think that Berkeley High should go back to its roots of really engaging in some free speech and debate about the issues, rather than thinking that we have to shelter kids from views that we think are hurtful. Sometimes we have to be able to hear it and understand where it comes from in order to know how to contend with it.
I have a hard time seeing if there's any questions for Pedro. Okay, right in the front. Okay,
Hello.
Good. Could you identify yourself?
Sure. My name is Rochelle Oakland. I work at Stanford University, and I currently serve in the role of Supported Education and Employment Specialist. I'm public school educated, elementary school, high school, college. And what I find when we talk about education, when there are existing schools. And so a lot of the times we show how great charter schools are doing, or other private schools that have been created by individuals that are not educators. And so what do we do with our public schools, where we have people that have studied education and have been doing the hard work? How do we make those schools great schools, and not just new schools, great schools?
So the schools I just mentioned, that the Eagle Academy, are all public schools. They're not charter schools, although they were created intentionally to serve a population. One of the things I know from having been involved in this work for a long time is that changing bad schools is very difficult, because the culture that sets in is very hard to transform. And so sometimes starting over can be helpful. But I do think, nonetheless, we can't always start over, and we got to figure out how to work within some of the schools that are just serving large numbers of kids. So what I've tried to do, and I'm living in Los Angeles now, and I try to take educators who are in struggling schools to other public schools just like theirs, serve the similar population, and serve them much better. I took a group recently from South LA to a school called Social Justice Humanitas. It has the 4th highest graduation rate in the city, and the 4th highest rate for sending kids who graduate from college. It's all low income, all kids of color. Excellent culture, has a waiting list. This is at a time when many public schools in LA are losing enrollment. They have high demand. I asked the teachers, what's the hardest thing about working here? Because they have very low teacher turnover. The hardest thing is that the kids evaluate us and actually tell us what they think. I asked the kids what makes this place special. They say because it feels like a family. So when you see schools like this that have found ways to not only compensate for poverty, but to create a successful learning environment, that's what we need to learn from. And unfortunately, we don't give educators a chance to see those schools. and learn that they in fact do it. Because if you've never seen them, after a while you think the problem is the kids.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Donald Zimmer. I'm a retired recovering public school superintendent, and I retired and then had the really great perspective of serving several years as head of school for some independent schools. So I've gotten a very interesting perspective. I have to be honest, I took a little umbrage when you said we ignore problems. And I think that's true in some cases, but I also think you're avoiding, or we haven't talked about, those of us who don't want to ignore problems, especially when I was in public sector, but we were contract constrained to addressing problems. And that a lot of what has evolved in systems, especially the one you talk about of assigning teachers who are the newest to the most difficult, which I find abhorrent and rampant. And how that occurs largely is a contract constrained issue. How do we then get the AFT, the CTA, people like that, to be focused on understanding how critical of an element that type of a contract language is? Because all too often, when you have no money, you give language like that. And that language is so detrimental to children. That's not addressed in anything I heard today.
Great question, fair question. So I'll give you an example. Fontana High School down in Southern California. Several years ago when I went to visit, I learned they had the highest advanced placement calculus scores in the county. So I asked the superintendent there, how do you get the highest calculus scores on the advanced placement? He said, well, we have the best calculus teacher around. And I convinced him to start teaching 2 sections of 9th grade math. Right? That is, he appealed directly to the teacher. And what that did was it got more kids into calculus later on, because until they did that, kids were not, because they had previously assigned their least experienced teachers to teach 9th grade. It also sent a message to the entire math department that we're not going to run away from the 9th graders. We're going to share that responsibility. So yes, the contract is often a constraint, but I meet districts that are finding ways to work around the contract by working with the union to figure out what's an equitable strategy. The conference we're doing in a few days, we're going to have both unions, presidents there, because I think the unions have to play a role in reform and not merely say no to change, but to say what kinds of changes we think are necessary, because schools where teachers feel supported are also going to be schools where students do better. So we got to bring them into the conversation.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Liz Cherie. I work for the City of Santa Monica, so I work for local government, and I know that you did some work with our school district. And my question is about partnership. I'm wondering if you could speak to partnership that you've seen worked really well, because part of our challenge in a well-resourced community is that our school district feels really overwhelmed, but is resistant to being told from outside agencies how to be supported. And so we get really caught up with really focusing in out-of-school time, but then we try to use what we do in out-of-school time to inform the school district on how they can improve their in-school time. But outside of finding individuals that we can collaborate with, we are really challenged to be a support system. So I'm curious if you can help us understand ways in policy so it's not just an individual relationship that can really sustain a valuable partnership between the district and the city and community-based organizations.
So thanks for the question. And as you know, I know Santa Monica well, because I live nearby and I've done work there. And I don't want to share everything. It won't be fair to the district that I know. But I would say this, because the city of Santa Monica invests in its schools, which I think is quite admirable, several $1 million a year. The sad thing is, the district can't even say what the money's spent on. And that to me is unacceptable. We need to, and this is, I think, also relevant to how we're doing the LCAP funding. Money matters, but only if it's invested wisely and if there's some accountability for it. They don't have that right now in your district. And I'm just shocked that they've been so generous in supporting the schools and so unwilling to ask for some evidence that the money's being used appropriately. And so I'd encourage you to push that. We did a report showing all the factors that are contributing to the disparities in achievement in that district, and there's been very little follow-through on that since that happened over a year and a half ago now. So, you know, yours is a district that has plenty of resources. and should be able to be a model for the state because of that. Sorry.
Pedro, just thank you. Just quickly before we close, you mentioned school discipline, and you're back in California. This is actually one area where California seems to have made some progress in the last few years. Suspension rates have gone down dramatically. Are you encouraged by that, or does California have to do more?
I feel like that the way I do about our rising graduation rates. It's a good sign, but I'm not convinced that we're there. And I know that because I visit a lot too many schools where they have reduced the suspension rate, but now they haven't addressed the issues, the discipline issues. They just don't suspend kids anymore for minor infractions, which is a good thing. So I want to acknowledge it's good not just send kids home. Now you still got to get them in class. You still have to deal with the behavior. You still haven't changed the culture. And that's what many schools don't get. When they implement restorative practices, they think it's a technique for how to do discipline, when in fact it comes from New Zealand, and it was really intended as a whole way in which to get kids to feel like they were connected to the school and to instill a sense of strong values and character in the schools. I don't see that happening nearly enough. So I would say that we've made a step in the right direction, but we have so many more steps to take. And my fear is that we don't even know that, that we are too busy celebrating. Just like the rising graduation rates. We should be happy to see graduation rates rising, but we know there's still far too many kids going to college who are unprepared and stuck in remedial courses. So we just can't celebrate too quickly.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Could we have a round of applause for Pedro Noguera? You really set the stage for our discussion going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you.